So I recently took a break from social media. It wasn't a long break. It was only like a day and a half. While I was on vacation this last weekend. But I mean, okay, but seriously, for somebody who, I'm that person who I check my phone like the first thing when I wake up in the morning. It's like the last thing I look at before I go to bed. I'm seeing nods of self-recognition in this. So it felt like a significant accomplishment to like actually put my phone down for over 36 hours. And while I recognize there's so many ways in which social media is not good for the mind or the soul, I also watched The Social Dilemma many years ago. I appreciate that it can facilitate connection in an increasingly busy and sometimes very isolating world. I mean, I like seeing my friends' pets and hobbies and trips to Mexico, but recently social media has been causing me a lot of distress. It always does, I think, particularly during an election year, and we're coming up on a fairly contentious municipal election this month here in Chicago, and I mean, I don't need to explain to any of you in this room why the election bearing down at us at the end of this year is causing even more stress. But I think in particular with the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and along with it, the deluge of updates and opinions and advocacy, it had become just too much. So I'm not gonna talk about the war. I felt the temperature of the room just go, so we're gonna breathe. I'm not gonna talk about the war, not today. But what has bothered me most over these last few months has been watching the growing division between friends and acquaintances who see themselves on one side of this conflict or the other, and not just in the opinions they hold, but how they understand the facts on the ground. Facts that contradict each other, that cannot coexist, that tell two completely different stories about what is happening overseas. And more disheartening, what pushed me to take a break from social media because it constantly pushed me to tears every night was that these same friends and acquaintances see those who disagree with them as ignorant or immoral or at worst inhuman. Now, polarization is not a new phenomena, but it has become more intense and more entrenched and more of a problem. It has repeatedly incapacitated Congress. It has torn apart our communities. It has broken up families. It's not just that we disagree on important issues. It is that disagreement has become an indictment of each other's character. Now, shortly before the advent of COVID, a study in the Annual Review of Political Science coined a new term for this shift: affective polarization. The authors observed in their study, they particularly looked at Democrats and Republicans, that both say that the other's party members are hypocritical and selfish and closed-minded, and even more disturbingly, they are unwilling to socialize across party lines. And you can imagine that the fight over vaccines and Black Lives Matter and the 2020 election and continued gun violence and Roe v. Wade has only made this worse. I get it though. In a world spinning out of control, having a clear sense of what is right and what is wrong, or who is right and who is wrong, gives us something solid to stand on. So I'm a big fan of high fantasy, think like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. And one of the consistent elements of the genre is that there is a hero and there is a villain. And although they might be given a particular motive, each is at their core inherently good or evil. And the story ends with the triumph of the former, of the good, and the defeat of the latter, the evil. And there's something very comforting about this construction, a world that could be fixed so easily by eliminating a single entity or element. But our world is much messier, much more complicated. We cannot be divided into good elves and evil orcs. We are humans, all of us morally inconsistent, all of us capable of both healing and hurting, with the capacity to tear down and build up. Fantasy is flat. Reality is much more complex. When looking at our Torah portion this week, the rabbis ask, what exactly is the sin of the golden calf? Now let me set the stage for us. We read a little bit about it before. So the Israelites are camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, having only recently been liberated from slavery in Egypt. And their leader, Moses, has been consulting God on the peak of the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights about. And seeing that he had not yet returned, the people turned to his brother Aaron and say, "Make a god for us, one that will continue to lead us on our journey," because Moses, the one who got us this far, seems to have disappeared. And so Aaron, as Rabbi Lizzie explained earlier, gathers the gold from the Israelites and places it in a mold and makes this molten calf. And the people gather around the statue and they celebrate and they exclaim, "This here is your God, O Israel, who has brought you out of the land of Egypt." So let's return to that question posed by the rabbis. What exactly is their sin in this moment? So perhaps their sin is idolatry. It's a violation of the very first commandment that was given to them just like a few moments ago. "You shall have no other God beside me," right? The whole like monotheism thing, right? But as the biblical scholar Joel Baden points out, the Israelites aren't creating a brand new God. In fact, they are quite certain about who the golden calf is supposed to represent, right? They say, "This is your God, O Israel, who has brought you out of the land of Egypt." It's that same God who brought down those plagues, that split the Red Sea, that provided them manna to eat and made them a free people. They may be exhibiting a lack of faith, he writes, but they're not historical revisionists. So perhaps their sin is impatience, a lack of trust that Moses would come back when Moses said that he would come back. The rabbis teach that when day 40 arrived, Satan, so Satan's like an adversarial, almost mischievous figure in our tradition, like who likes to sow discord. So don't like picture like the devil with the horns and the tail. No, like the Satan is like this kind of mischievous figure who likes to sow discord. So Satan arrives and started to spread rumors. Maybe he had forgotten them. Maybe he had abandoned them. Maybe Moses had died. And so the people begin to worry, and their worry soon turns to distrust and despair. The people need reassurance, something tangible they can hold on to. And the golden calf is immediate and easily understood, something they could see, something they could literally touch. But maybe that's actually their sin, trying to constrain God, right, the source of all life, the creator of all things, into something so small and pedestrian. The golden calf is an attempt to take something that challenges their understanding of the world and turn it into something familiar, something known, something not unlike the idols that they had walked by every day back in Egypt. It is the sin of imposing the flatness of fantasy onto the complicated contours of reality. Now, Revelation is uncomfortable. It had upset everything our ancestors thought they knew about the world, not only in toppling empires and dismantling social structures that had been in place for centuries, they had been slaves for over 400 years, but in showing them a God that is expansive, both capable of being experienced by each of us, yet unable to be fully known or understood by any one of us alone. The rabbis teach that when our ancestors stood at Mount Sinai, every single person encountered the divine in their own way, whether because of where they quite literally stood, or because of how tall or short they were, or because they lived with a disability, or because of their age or their gender identity, or the abundance of blessing that had been given to them, or the heartbreak that they carried in that moment. The rabbis go even further, saying that our ancestors were joined by the souls of every single Jew who came before them, and every single Jew who would one day come into existence. And not only Jews, but all people. Rabbi Yochanan teaches that when God spoke in 70 languages at once, so that the whole world might understand. And so the result is that the only way that any one of us could construct a complete picture of the divine is by speaking to every single person who was and who is and who will be. How much simpler to stand around a golden statue and have each person say, "That's a cow. That's a cow," right? That's a cow. How much more challenging to create mutual understanding, but how much richer for all of us to share our moment of revelation precious and unique. For me to say that God spoke like thunder, and for you to say that God came to you like a flash of lightning, and for her to say that God felt like being cradled by her mother, and for him to say that God held him with the ecstasy of a lover, and for them to say that they don't believe in God at all, but there was something there, a thread that ties us together, reminding us in our loneliness or most selfish that we are always part of something greater than just ourselves. The sin of the golden calf is a reminder that the truth is much larger than what any of us are able to grasp alone. It is also a warning to not make idols of our own worldview, even when it's shared by others. So a recent study by MIT philosopher Kevin Dorst explored the processes that drive polarization, showing that people will aggressively scrutinize evidence that contradicts their existing point of view while more readily accepting what supports it. It is trusting what is familiar, of imposing the flatness of our own biases on a reality that is complex and nuanced and shot through with uncertainty. People who develop radically different views, Dorst concludes, are not necessarily being misled or reacting emotionally, but in part are responding rationally to genuinely ambiguous information. The problem is that in our drive to reduce ambiguity, we can oversimplify. And in oversimplification, we lay the groundwork for effective polarization. For if we don't trust information that contradicts our worldview, we become equally suspicious of the people who believe it. And if what they know to be true is wrong, they must also be wrong. And if they are so intractably wrong, well, then perhaps what would set the world right again is them not existing at all. It's not that specific issues are unimportant. Jonathan Weiler, a political scientist at the University of North Carolina, recently opined, but they become secondary in a sense to the gut-level hatred and mistrust that now defines our politics. He cites a poll that shows a startling increase pre-pandemic to this moment in how we perceive those who do not think like us. It's not that we simply feel they're misguided. We believe that they're inherently immoral. And why would we want to associate with someone who is dishonest or unprincipled? So we surround ourselves with the people who agree with us, those who see a broad truth through our same narrow lens. We create an idol of our own opinions, tests of moral purity that determine who is in and who is out. Do you agree that God is a golden calf? Great, you're in. The journalist Jessica Gross wrote a few months ago, "The attitude seems to be in our world right now, you have to agree with me about everything or you're my enemy, and we can't work together on anything." We give into the fantasy that we are the heroes, we're always the heroes, by the way, of our own story, and that they are the villains, a tale of elves and orcs that reduces the complexity of human beings into dangerously inhuman caricatures. Dangerous because it's much easier to kill an orc than a person. And I don't want to suggest that any of us here in this room wish harm on those who disagree with us, although I'm sure that each of us has seen this suggested by politicians and pundits alike. But I do want each of us to take seriously how the belief that we and those who are like us have an exclusive claim on the truth contributes to an effective polarization that dehumanizes those who think differently, that this so easily leads to hatred and to violence. The thing is, maybe you're right. Maybe you're right about any given issue. But the thing is, perhaps you're wrong. And honestly, chances are you're partially right, and so are the people you disagree with. And the only way to know, the only way to continue refining our understanding of the world is by remaining open to other ideas of what could be true. Now, some of these are going to be easy to dismiss out of hand because they're so far removed from fact or unmoored from commonly shared ethics. I'm not proposing moral relativism here. However, I imagine many more ideas will challenge us and provoke us to think about our opinions more deeply and reshape how we think for the better. The author Adam Grant suggests that we should approach the world as a scientist. We have a hypothesis of what we believe to be right, but we are willing and ready to correct it for the sake of truth. And like a scientist, we are excited to learn new information because it helps us refine our understanding and grow in our knowledge of what we care about the most. And at the very least, by seeing every single person, this is a challenge, but by seeing every single person as holding a piece of the truth that we are not able to access by ourselves, we work against the forces of polarization that would divide our country and our communities and even this room into intractable groups of us and them. And so when I was done with my very admittedly short social media break, I decided that I wasn't going to unfollow or unfriend the people I disagreed with. Because sometimes their posts challenge me, and sometimes their posts break my heart. But in each moment, I am able to learn about myself, about people who are like me, and most importantly, about people who are not like me. And then I click through to their profile to see their photos of dogs and cats, and hobbies, and vacations somewhere warm, to remind myself that they are human, as complex and complicated, frustratingly irreducible, and beautifully nuanced as the world we live in. So my blessing for all of us is that we are able to see in ourselves and in each other that glimpse of revelation, uniquely our own, yet part of something so much larger and so much more magnificent and so much more inspiring than what we could imagine by ourselves. Shabbat shalom.
You can applaud. Shkoyach.